Wringer Chapter 24. Palmer came home that day to find Dorothy shooting baskets in his room. "I asked your mother if I could come in," she said, "so I could play basketball." Palmer sniffed. "That's a lie. You're here for Nipper." He glanced out the window. The pigeon was due home any minute. Dorothy laughed and bounced the weightless ball off Palmer's forehead. "Stop me," she growled, scooping up the ball, and suddenly she was leaping into him, over him, her knees in his chest, jamming the ball into the 4.5-foot-high basket, and shrieking, "In your nose, out your toes!" She laughed and bounced the ball off his nose. When he got over the shock, Palmer joined her, the two of them flinging the ball at each other and cackling like a pair of chickens. Palmer wasn't surprised to find Dorothy in his room. Since he'd told her about Nipper, she'd come over often. His mother was thrilled that Dorothy was back in his life, received like a daughter. As for the Beans boys, as they sometimes called themselves, by spring they had tired of tormenting Dorothy and pretty much ignored her. Still, she did not come over when they were around, and whenever she saw Palmer with them at school, she acted as if she did not know him. Palmer sensed that she was doing this for his sake. Dorothy sat on the edge of Palmer's homework desk. "So, how was the big party, Snots?" she said with a sneer. Palmer shrugged. Okay." "What gross stuff did you do, you and your best friends? Did you eat a dead muskrat, Snots?" "Not really, and don't call me Snots." "Why not? That's your name, Snots, isn't it? Snots." When Dorothy talked this way, Palmer could not always tell if she was serious. "It's just my gang name," he said. "I sure am sorry I'm not in the gang," Dorothy said. "Look at all the great stuff I'm missing. No neat name for me, no dead muskrats, no torturing people on the way home from school every day, no making mother scream, no treatment on my birthday." She rolled up her sleeve. She put on a pouty face. "Look at that, Snots, not one bruise. I want a black and blue arm. I want to have to do everything with one hand. I want some pain." Palmer's middle knuckle rose from his fist. He came at her with a wicked grin. "Okay." Dorothy screamed and hopped from the desk. They reeled about the room, her screaming, him laughing, and it wasn't until they quieted down that they heard the tapping. "Nipper!" Nipper was let in, and as usual went straight to the top of Palmer's head. This brought a complaint from Dorothy. "He never stands on my head. I want him to stand on my head, Palmer." "Hold still," said Palmer. He leaned in towards Dorothy until their foreheads were touching. "Go ahead, Nipper. Go to Dorothy." Nipper would not move from his perch. Dorothy stomped her foot. "Phooey!" "Wait a minute," said Palmer excitedly. He transferred Nipper to the basket room, left the room, and returned a minute later. "Nipper has a thing about ears," he said, "especially if there's something in your ear. One day I had an earache and I had one of these in my ear." He held up a small wad of cotton. "He kept pulling it out." Dorothy took the cotton wad and pressed it into her left ear. "Yoo-hoo, Nipper!" she called. "Look what's in my ear!" She stood in the middle of the room with her left ear to the rim. Without delay, Nipper flew to her head, bent down, and plucked out the wad. He flew back to the rim and let the wad fall through the net. Palmer and Dorothy cheered. "Two!" Palmer scooped up the foam ball, slam-dunked it, and thrust his chin at Nipper. "In your face, bird!" Nipper nodded and pecked him on the nose. Dorothy cracked up. They were laughing and playing ball when Palmer, letting fly a long shot from beyond the bed, said, "Do you like my father?" Dorothy watched the ball bounce off the door. "What kind of question is that?" "Well, do you?" "Sure. Why?" "Do you think he's a nice guy?" Yeah, don't you? Palmer thought for a moment. Yeah, he is. I guess that's the problem. Dorothy rolled her eyes. You're talking goofy. What's the problem? The golden bird, Palmer said. Dorothy threw the ball at him. Will you please make some sense? Palmer looked across the room at Dorothy. She was back on his homework desk, brown hair funneled into a ponytail by a plain rubber band. Pale blue t-shirt, jeans, black and white sneakers, swinging above the floor. Same old across-the-street Dorothy he'd known all his life. And yet, somehow, not the same old Dorothy. Though she looked the same as always, Palmer had been seeing something else in her lately. Whatever it was, it registered not in his eyes, but in his feelings, and was most clearly known to him by its absence in the company of anyone but her. It made him feel floating. The previous summer, Palmer's mother had taken him to the outdoor Y pool for swimming lessons. The first lesson was floating. The instructor told him to just throw his head back, bring up his feet, and allow himself to lie on his back in the water. This made no sense at all to Palmer. All of his life's experience told him that if he left his feet, he would fall. Or in the case of water, he would sink. Relax, the instructor kept saying. Trust the water. It will hold you up. But Palmer could not trust the water. For many days he could not trust it, and then, with the instructor promising not to let him sink, he tried it. With the instructor's hand on the small of his back, he tilted back, until he felt water on his neck and on his ears. The instructor's hand pushed gently upward. Palmer's feet left the floor of the pool. Lie back, relax, said the instructor. Pretend it's your bed. Trust it. He lay back. He tried to trust. He could see nothing but the instructor's face, and, beyond, the vast blue sky. And then the instructor's face was gone, his hand was gone, and his voice was saying, You're floating. Palmer got the same feeling with Dorothy. He knew that he could let go, and she would hold him up. Tears filled his eyes. He let go. I don't want to be a ringer, but everyone else is a ringer when they're 10, and I'm going to be 10 in 71 days, and then I'm going to have to be a ringer too. But I don't want to. So what kind of a kid am I? Everybody wants to kill pigeons but me. What's the matter with me? He said it all. He said things he'd been thinking and feeling for years. He said things he didn't even know he had been thinking until he heard them come out of his mouth. He told her how he hated the golden bird, the trophy his father had won one year for shooting the most pigeons. He told her it confused him. How could one person be both a shooter of pigeons and a loving father? He apologized for joining in on the tree stumping and for calling her names. You don't really look like a fish, he said. Oh, thank you, she said. He apologized for not inviting her to his last birthday party. He apologized for the muskrat carcass. My mother was shaking, she said. He told her about Bean's party and the night they came for him in his bed and led him to the railroad station and the boxes of birds. He told her about the time Nipper flew overhead and was seen by the guys, and how scary it was to be the only person in town with a pigeon, and about his dreams at night. He told her that sometimes he wished he had not joined up with the guys after all, and he told her again and again and again that he really did not want to be a ringer. Dorothy hopped down from the desk. She walked across the room and stood before Palmer and looked straight into his eyes. Then don't, she said. She made it sound so simple. Palmer snickered. He got up from the bed, kicked the ball around. Yeah, don't. Easy for you to say. You're not a boy. You didn't grow up all your life scared to be 10. I have an idea, said Dorothy brightly. Why don't you just skip 10 and go right to 11? Or tell everybody your birth certificate was wrong and you just found out you're really 21. Palmer stomped his foot, sending Nipper in a flutter from the basket rim. It's not funny, Dorothy shrugged. Well, you didn't like my serious answer. If you don't want to be a ringer, don't be a ringer. She sat on the bed. Palmer shrieked, I can't not be a ringer. Nipper flew to the bedstead. Everybody's a ringer. You have to be a ringer. That's how it always was. You don't know. You're not a boy. You're a girl. What do you think? He sneered into her face. I can be the only boy in the history of the town who was ever not a ringer? And what makes you think? He poked his finger at her. What makes you think that Beans would ever let me get away with it? They'd drag me out of this bed and out to the park. They'd wring my neck. From her seat on the bed, Dorothy stared at the poking finger. She took hold of it and pulled it, drawing Palmer closer until his face was inches from hers. At that point, she grabbed his earlobes and pulled him closer still. She smiled broadly. She kissed the end of his nose, and she laughed. Palmer froze for a moment, stunned, then crumpled into laughter himself. They laughed and played games with Nipper for the rest of the afternoon.